I watched him brag about his financial expertise at dinner while transferring our savings to his mistress's account. What he didn't know was that I'd been silently managing his family's $50 million trust fund for the past decade. Tomorrow, the trustees would learn exactly how their golden boy had been spending their legacy. I sat at our mahogany dining table, maintaining my carefully crafted mask of quiet admiration as my husband Charles held court during another extravagant family dinner. The crystal chandeliers, which I'd actually selected for their investment potential, cast a warm glow over the scene, highlighting the Rolex on his wrist as he gestured dramatically, explaining his latest brilliant investment strategy to his captivated parents. "You see, diversification is key," he proclaimed, pausing to take another sip of the Chateau Lafite Rothschild I'd acquired through the vineyard investment I'd orchestrated for his family's portfolio last year. "That's why I've been moving significant assets into emerging markets." Under the table, my phone buzzed with another transaction alert. $175,000 transferred from our joint account to Business Consulting Services, LLC. The third such transfer this month. I suppressed a smile, thinking of the shell company his mistress Victoria had so cleverly registered in Delaware. Not quite clever enough, though. Every transaction, every account, every digital footprint had been meticulously documented by the very person they all thought needed financial guidance. "Charles has always had such a brilliant mind for money," his mother Margaret cooed, adjusting her tennis bracelet, another piece bought with trust fund money I'd allocated. "Elizabeth, darling, you're so fortunate to have someone who can handle all these complex financial matters for you." I nodded demurely, playing my role perfectly. "I know I couldn't manage without him," I replied softly, watching Charles preen at the praise. If only they knew that their mysterious financial advisor, the one who had tripled their family's wealth over the past decade, was sitting right here, pretending to be financially illiterate. "Speaking of management, Charles's father Richard," interjected, his ruddy face glowing with pride and expensive wine. "The trust's performance has been absolutely remarkable. That advisor is worth every penny of their fee." Charles's face tightened almost imperceptibly at the mention of the advisor, the nameless, faceless financial wizard who controlled his access to the family fortune. He'd tried countless times to discover their identity, to charm or pressure them into allowing him greater control over the trust. Every attempt had been meticulously documented in my growing file. "More wine, darling?" I asked sweetly, already reaching for the bottle. Charles nodded absently, his attention returning to his phone. I watched his fingers move across the screen, knowing exactly what he was typing. Another message to Victoria, probably promising her the Aspen condo he'd been trying to get the trust to purchase. "The market insights this advisor has are uncanny," Richard continued, oblivious to his son's distraction. "Remember that tech stock recommendation last quarter? Doubled our investment in 3 months." I remembered. I'd spent weeks analyzing that company, recognizing its potential before the market caught on. Just like I'd spent years watching Charles, documenting his patterns of financial infidelity, his attempts to circumvent the trust's restrictions, and most recently, his elaborate scheme to funnel money to his mistress through fake consulting contracts. "Elizabeth, you really should let Charles teach you more about investing," Margaret suggested, her voice carrying that subtle condescension I'd grown so accustomed to. "A woman should understand at least the basics of finance, don't you think?" I thought about my double degrees in financial engineering and economics from MIT, the years I'd spent at Goldman Sachs before being headhunted to manage ultra-high net worth family offices, and the sophisticated investment algorithms I'd developed that had helped me grow the Richardson family fortune from $50 million to over $150 million. "Oh, it all just goes over my head," I laughed lightly, watching Charles smirk behind his wine glass. Numbers have never been my strong suit. My phone buzzed again, this time a calendar reminder for tomorrow morning's emergency trustee meeting. In less than 18 hours, the carefully constructed facade would crumble. The trustees would learn that their brilliant financial advisor was actually Charles's supposedly financially inept wife. They would see the evidence I'd gathered of his systematic theft through inflated invoices and fake consulting contracts. They would understand how their precious son had been secretly funneling trust money to fund his affair while simultaneously draining our joint accounts. "Another successful quarter calls for a celebration," Charles announced, standing to fetch a special bottle from the wine cellar. As his footsteps faded, I excused myself to powder my nose, stepping into the hallway just in time to see him send another message to Victoria. "All set for Aspen next week. Just have to convince the trust advisor about that property investment." I smiled, thinking of the comprehensive report sitting in my private office upstairs, ready to be presented to the trustees tomorrow. It detailed every transaction, every lie, every attempt to defraud both the trust and his wife. The crystal glasses clinked in the dining room as Charles returned with more wine, his parents' adoring laughter echoing through our marble hallways. Let them laugh. By this time tomorrow, they would all understand exactly who had been managing their money, and more importantly, who had been stealing it. The story of how I became the secret guardian of the Richardson family fortune began 12 years ago, long before I met Charles. Back then, I was Elizabeth Chen, the youngest ever partner at Sterling Capital Management, known for my ability to turn struggling family fortunes into thriving dynasties. My specialty was rescuing old money from the poor decisions of entitled heirs, a skill that would prove ironically useful in my personal life. I first encountered the Richardsons professionally when Richard Richardson Sr. approached Sterling Capital, desperate to protect his family's wealth from his son's increasingly reckless spending. Charles had already burned through 3 trust funds by age 30, and his father was determined to preserve what remained of their legacy. "My son has expensive tastes," Richard had explained during our first meeting, unaware that I was listening in as the junior partner on the video call. "He thinks money is endless. Last month, he tried to purchase a yacht with trust funds meant for his future children's education." The senior partners assigned me to analyze the Richardson case, expecting a standard wealth protection strategy. Instead, I discovered something fascinating. Charles wasn't just careless with money. He was systematically exploiting weaknesses in the trust structure, using shell companies and inflated invoices to bypass spending restrictions. His methods were clever, but left clear patterns for someone who knew where to look. I developed a revolutionary protection strategy for the Richardson Trust, creating a layered system of oversight that would make it virtually impossible to misuse funds without detection. The family was impressed, but they never knew it was the quiet Asian woman in the background of their video calls who had saved their fortune. When I left Sterling Capital to start my own family office consulting firm, the Richardsons were my first private clients. I maintained my anonymity at their request. Old money families often preferred their financial advisors to remain faceless. Little did I know how valuable that anonymity would become. I met Charles at a charity gala 3 months later. He was charming, handsome, and completely unaware that he was flirting with the person who had recently restricted his access to the family fortune. His attempt to impress me with financial jargon was amusing. He was literally quoting from reports I had written. "The key to wealth management is understanding market psychology," he declared confidently, repeating almost word for word a passage from my last quarterly letter to his family. "It's about seeing patterns others miss." I played along, acting suitably impressed. By then, I had learned that men like Charles preferred their women financially dependent. 3 failed relationships with men who resented my success had taught me caution. So when Charles pursued me, I decided to conduct an experiment. I presented myself as a gallery curator with a modest income and limited financial knowledge. The courtship was a masterclass in manipulation. His, in trying to impress, me with his wealth and mine, in hiding the fact that I controlled it. He took me to expensive restaurants, bought lavish gifts, and constantly reminded me how fortunate I was to have found someone so financially secure. "Don't worry about money, darling," he would say, casually dropping thousands on wine while I pretended to be concerned about the expense. "I know how to take care of my women." I maintained my cover through our engagement, quietly amused as he insisted on a prenuptial agreement to protect his assets. The document, which I reviewed with my own lawyers while pretending to be too trusting to read it carefully, was ironclad, in my favor. Charles had been so focused on protecting his trust fund that he failed to notice the clauses about joint accounts and community property. The wedding was extravagant, paid for with trust money I had allocated. I watched from behind my champagne glass as Charles bragged to his friends about his brilliant investment strategies, all of which had come from my quarterly recommendations to the trust. "Elizabeth doesn't need to worry about finances," he announced at our reception. "She has me to handle all that complicated stuff." His father nodded approvingly, while his mother patted my hand condescendingly. "So wonderful to have a man who understands money," she said. "So many young women these days think they can manage on their own." I smiled, thinking of the algorithmic trading system I had developed that was at that moment executing trades for their portfolio. "I'm just lucky to have Charles," I replied, playing my part perfectly. For the first few years of our marriage, the arrangement worked well. I maintained my anonymous role as the family's financial advisor while playing the part of the financially naive wife. Charles got the adoring spouse his ego needed, while I protected his family's wealth, often from him. But 3 years ago, I noticed a change in the pattern of his attempted trust fund withdrawals. Requests for property investments in unusual locations, large consultancy fees to newly registered companies, sporadic transfers that didn't match his usual spending habits. A lesser financial analyst might have missed the signs, but I had built my career on spotting exactly these kinds of irregularities. It took only 2 days of discreet investigation to discover Victoria Pierce, a former model turned business consultant who had caught Charles's wandering eye. My husband had finally found someone who matched his talent for financial manipulation. Together, they had concocted an elaborate scheme to siphon money from both the trust and our joint accounts. I could have exposed them immediately, but my years in wealth management had taught me patience. Instead, I watched, documented, and waited, letting them weave a web of financial deceit so complete that there would be no possibility of escape when I finally revealed the truth. After all, revenge, like investment, is all about timing. The signs of Charles's betrayal became impossible to ignore last month, though I had been quietly documenting them for over a year. I sat in my private home office, a small room Charles dismissed as my hobby space for managing our household budget, watching transaction alerts flash across my secure monitors. In the past 24 hours alone, he had attempted to access the trust fund 6 times for emergency business investments. Mrs. Richardson, Sarah, my most trusted associate, appeared on my encrypted video call. "We've completed the audit you requested. The pattern is concerning." I pulled up the files she had sent, each one adding another piece to the puzzle of Charles's deception. Credit card statements showed dinner reservations for 2 at restaurants I'd never visited, hotel bookings in cities where he'd claimed to have business meetings, and most tellingly, a pattern of increasing attempts to circumvent the trust fund's protective measures. "Show me the property acquisitions," I instructed, watching as a map populated with red dots, locations where Charles had tried to purchase real estate through the trust. Aspen, Miami, Paris. Each one coincidentally close to where Victoria had modeling shoots scheduled. "There's more," Sarah continued, sharing her screen. "We've traced the shell companies. Victoria Pierce isn't just his mistress. She's systematically targeting trust fund beneficiaries. Charles is her 3rd wealthy conquest in 5 years." I leaned back in my chair, thinking of all the times Charles had patronizingly explained investment strategies to me, strategies I had actually developed. Just last week, he'd spent an hour lecturing me about diversification while simultaneously trying to concentrate trust assets into properties he could share with Victoria. The latest transfer attempt was flagged 10 minutes ago, Sarah reported. $2.5 million for a business development opportunity in the Maldives. I pulled up the property listing, a private villa with a suspicious similarity to Victoria's recent Instagram dream destination post. The request had been automatically denied by the protection protocols I'd put in place years ago. Elizabeth? Charles's voice echoed up the stairs. Darling, where are you? The car's waiting. We're due at my parents' for dinner in 30 minutes. Just finishing up some household accounts, I called back, quickly switching my monitors to a basic Excel spreadsheet of grocery expenses. Right one cue, Charles appeared in the doorway, adjusting his Hermes tie, purchased with trust fund money I had approved. Still struggling with those numbers? He asked, his tone dripping with condescension. You know you can just let me handle all that. Speaking of which, he paused, trying to look casual. Did you get a chance to move those funds into our joint account like we discussed? Ah, yes, the joint account. The one he'd been systematically draining to fund his affair, thinking I was too financially inept to notice. Just yesterday, he'd convinced me to transfer another $200,000 from my personal savings, claiming it was for a sure-thing investment opportunity. All done, I smiled, playing my role perfectly, though I'm not sure I understood all those banking instructions. Don't worry your pretty head about it, he replied, checking his phone as another message from Victoria lit up the screen. That's why you have me. As we drove to his parents' house in his new Mercedes, another trust fund purchase I had approved, I thought about the meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning. The trustees would see everything: the attempted property purchases, the shell companies, the systematic theft from our joint accounts, and most importantly, Victoria's history of targeting and defrauding wealthy men. Charles's phone buzzed again. From the angle of his screen, I could read Victoria's message. Can't wait for our Maldives getaway, baby. Just think, 2 whole weeks in paradise. I suppressed a smile, thinking of the comprehensive case I had built. Every message, every transaction, every lie documented and organized. The trust fund protection system I had designed wasn't just about preventing unauthorized spending. It was about creating an unassailable record of attempted fraud. Mother's been asking about grandchildren, Charles mentioned as we pulled into his parents' driveway. I told her we're focusing on building our financial security first. The irony was exquisite. While he was secretly planning a luxurious getaway with his mistress, I had been quietly liquidating our joint investments and documenting every attempt he made to access restricted trust funds. Whatever you think is best, dear, I replied softly, watching him straighten his tie in the rearview mirror. You know I trust you completely with our financial future. He smiled that confident smile I had come to know so well, the smile of a man who thought he was brilliantly deceiving everyone around him. In less than 24 hours, that smile would vanish, along with his access to the fortune he had tried so hard to exploit. After all, the best traps are the ones where the prey walks in willingly, never suspecting that their own arrogance has become their prison. After dinner with the Richardsons, I retreated to my private office while Charles went to catch up on some work emails, code for his nightly video call with Victoria. The soft glow of my monitors illuminated the space as I began my final preparations for tomorrow's revelation. All trustees have confirmed their attendance, Sarah reported through our secure line, including the family's longtime lawyer, Jonathan Mills. He seemed particularly interested when I mentioned potential trust fund misappropriation. I pulled up my carefully organized evidence files, each one meticulously cataloged and cross-referenced. Show me the latest surveillance photos. The images appeared on my screen. Charles and Victoria at a private dining room in the Four Seasons. Last week, him showing her brochures of the Maldives villa. Another set from 2 days ago, them visiting a luxury car dealership, Victoria pointing excitedly at a $180,000 Porsche. All paid for with money from our joint account, which he'd been systematically draining. The forensic accountants finished their analysis, Sarah continued, sharing a detailed spreadsheet. Over the past year, he's diverted approximately $2.1 million from your joint accounts to various shell companies linked to Victoria, plus another $4.5 million in attempted trust fund withdrawals for business investments, all of which our systems blocked. I opened another file, Victoria's background report. This wasn't her first time orchestrating such a scheme. 3 years ago, she'd convinced a shipping magnate's son to invest in a fake business venture. Before that, she'd manipulated a tech entrepreneur into buying her multiple properties. Both men had been too embarrassed to press charges when her deceptions were discovered. The trust fund audit is complete as well, Sarah added. Charles has made 17 attempts to modify the trust's investment protocols in the past 6 months, each time trying to remove the requirements for secondary authorization on large transactions. I smiled, remembering how I'd designed those protocols specifically to prevent such manipulation. Charles had no idea that every attempted modification had generated automated alerts, creating an even stronger case against him. What about the offshore accounts? I asked, though I already knew the answer. We'd been tracking those for months. 3 accounts identified in the Cayman Islands, Sarah confirmed, all linked to Business Consulting Services LLC, Victoria's shell company. The latest transfer was processed yesterday, $175,000 from your joint account, tagged as business development fees. Through the office door, I could hear Charles laughing at something on his phone. Probably another message from Victoria about their planned getaway. He still thought he was the financial mastermind, the clever manipulator hiding his tracks. He had no idea that every digital footprint, every transaction, every message had been captured and cataloged. The trustees' information packets are ready, Sarah reported, pulling up a series of documents. Individual portfolios for each board member, detailing every aspect of Charles's financial misconduct, plus comprehensive evidence of Victoria's history of targeting wealthy men. I reviewed the presentation materials one final time. The story they told was damning, a systematic pattern of deception, attempted fraud, and betrayal. But it wasn't just about exposing Charles's affair or his financial infidelity. This was about revealing a deeper truth, how his entire persona of financial expertise was a carefully maintained fiction. What about the trust fund performance comparisons? I asked. New charts appeared on my screen, showing 2 distinct patterns. Charles's personal investment attempts, a history of losses and risky ventures, versus my management of the family trust, consistent growth and strategic success. The contrast is striking, Sarah noted. Under your management, the trust has grown from $50 million to $150 million. Meanwhile, every personal investment Charles has attempted would have resulted in significant losses if our protocols hadn't prevented them. I heard Charles's footsteps in the hallway and quickly switched my monitors to their innocuous mode, displaying a simple household budget spreadsheet. He appeared in the doorway, looking pleased with himself. Still working on those numbers, darling? He asked, loosening his tie. Don't stay up too late. You know how these things confuse you. Just trying to understand our monthly expenses, I replied softly. Some of these charges seem quite large. Leave all that to me. He smiled patronizingly. I've got some exciting investment opportunities in the works. Very exclusive deals, the kind that could really secure our future. I thought of the Maldives villa, the Porsche dealership, the offshore accounts. You're so good with money, I murmured. I don't know what I'd do without you. After he left, I returned to my preparation. One by one, I reviewed the key components of tomorrow's revelation: the trust fund audit, the surveillance evidence, the forensic accounting reports, Victoria's background file, And most importantly, my own credentials and track record as the family's actual financial advisor. Final check on the morning logistics, Sarah prompted. Trustees arrive at 9 a.m., I confirmed. Charles has his regular investment meeting with his latest cryptocurrency group at the same time, which means he'll be with Victoria at the 4. Seasons as usual. By the time he realizes something's wrong, the trust fund access will already be frozen. I closed my laptop, thinking of the elaborate deception Charles thought he had created. He saw himself as the clever one, the financial wizard hiding his tracks. Tomorrow, he would learn what true financial expertise looked like, and exactly who had been managing his family's fortune all along. After all, the best revenge isn't just about exposing lies, it's about revealing truths that were hidden in plain sight. The morning of the trustees' meeting dawned with an air of inevitability. I'd barely slept, running through final checks of my evidence and preparation. Charles, oblivious to the impending destruction of his carefully crafted lies, was humming in the shower, probably anticipating his regular Thursday morning rendezvous with Victoria. "Don't wait up for me tonight, darling," he called out, adjusting. His tie in the mirror, the $400 Hermes tie I'd watched him buy for Victoria last month, claiming it was for a business associate. Big investment meeting that might run late. I sat at my vanity, carefully applying mascara while my phone silently buzzed with updates from Sarah. The trustees were already gathering at the Richardson Financial Group headquarters. Charles's father had insisted on a 9 a.m. start, concerned about the urgent financial irregularities our memo had hinted at. "Everything all right?" Charles asked, noticing my slightly shaky hands. "You seem tense." "Just worried about our account balance," I replied softly, playing my role one final time. "I noticed some large withdrawals yesterday." He waved dismissively, checking his Rolex, another trust fund purchase I'd approved. "Business expenses, honey. You know how these things work." "Well, actually, you don't, but that's why you have me." He chuckled at his own joke. My phone buzzed. Again. Sarah's message was clear. "Victoria's been spotted entering the Four Seasons. Surveillance confirms hotel room booked under her usual alias." "I might transfer some more money from my savings," I ventured, watching Charles's reaction in the mirror. "For that investment opportunity you mentioned." His eyes lit up with poorly concealed greed. "Excellent idea, darling. The timing couldn't be better. In fact," he paused, trying to sound casual, "if you could do that this morning, there's a particularly promising venture I'd like to move on quickly." I thought of the Maldives villa listing I'd found on his laptop, the one he'd been planning to surprise Victoria with. The down payment was due today, $500,000 from our joint account that he'd been slowly draining. "Of course, dear," I smiled, reaching for my phone. "I trust you completely with our finances." Charles kissed my cheek, already heading for the door. "That's my girl. Don't worry your pretty head about the details. Just transfer the money, and I'll handle everything else." As his footsteps echoed down the hallway, I opened my banking app and initiated the transfer he'd requested. But instead of moving money into our joint account, I was triggering a carefully prepared series of transactions that would reveal every one of his financial deceptions. "He's leaving now," Sarah's voice came through my earpiece. "Surveillance confirms he's heading to the Four Seasons." I watched through our security cameras as Charles got into his Mercedes, purchased with trust fund money, and drove away, undoubtedly rehearsing the lies he'd tell Victoria about their upcoming luxury getaway. He had no idea that every word, every message, every promise he'd made to her had been documented and would soon be revealed to his family. My phone rang. Charles's mother, right on schedule. "Elizabeth, darling." Margaret's condescending voice filled my ear. "I just wanted to check that you're still coming to brunch on Sunday. And please do try to dress appropriately this time. The country club has standards." I thought of all the times she'd subtly belittled me, suggested I was beneath their social status, questioned my ability to fit into their world of old money and privilege. "Of course, Margaret. Whatever you think is best. That's a good girl, she replied, her tone dripping with satisfaction. Oh, and do remember to bring your checkbook. The club's charity auction is this weekend, and we wouldn't want a repeat of last year's embarrassment when you couldn't properly contribute. Last year's embarrassment had been Charles's doing. He'd drained our joint account just before the event, leaving me unable to bid on the overpriced auction items. Of course, he'd blamed it on a banking error that would be resolved soon. I'll make sure everything's in order, I assured her, pulling up the final piece of evidence on my laptop. Proof that Charles had used charity auction payments to fund shopping sprees with Victoria. As I ended the call, another notification flashed across my screen. Charles had just attempted to access the trust fund again, trying to push through the Maldives villa payment. The automated system blocked it as designed, but this time it triggered a different response, an immediate alert to all trustees about suspicious activity. Mrs. Richardson? Sarah's voice returned. The trustees are all assembled. Your father-in-law just received the alert about Charles's latest attempt. He's not happy. I stood, smoothing my Saint Laurent suit, an investment in appearance that Charles had mocked as unnecessary for a simple housewife. In my briefcase were copies of every document, every transaction record, every piece of evidence that would expose not just his affair, but his years of financial manipulation and deceit. It's time, I said, picking up my keys. The same keys that unlocked our mansion, bought with trust fund money that Charles thought he controlled. By tonight, he would understand exactly who had been pulling the financial strings all along. Phone buzzed one final time, a message from Charles. Just transferred the investment money. You're the best, baby. Don't know what I'd do without you. I smiled, thinking of the trustees waiting at headquarters, of Charles and Victoria celebrating at the Four Seasons, of all the pieces finally falling into place. Don't worry, darling, I whispered to the empty room. You're about to find out. The Richardson Financial Group headquarters gleamed in the morning sun, its glass and steel exterior reflecting my composed expression as I walked through the revolving doors. The security guard, who had always treated me with thinly veiled condescension as Charles's wife, did a double take at my appearance. Gone was the deliberately modest clothing and hesitant demeanor. Today, I wore power like a second skin, dressed in a perfectly tailored Chanel suit that spoke of quiet authority. Mrs. Richardson? He stammered. The trustees are expecting Ms. Chen, I corrected him smoothly, presenting a different ID badge than my usual visitor's pass. Chief Financial Advisor to the Richardson Trust. His eyes widened as he processed the name he'd seen countless times on internal memos, but had never connected to Charles's financially challenged wife. I swept past him, heels clicking purposefully against the marble floor as I headed toward the executive elevator, the one Charles had always told me I wasn't authorized to use. Everything is in place, Sarah murmured through my earpiece as I ascended to the top floor. All trustees present, including Mr. Mills from legal. Charles was seen entering the Four Seasons 10 minutes ago. Victoria arrived earlier with several shopping bags. I smiled, thinking of the credit card charges already showing up on our joint account. Charges that would help illustrate my point perfectly. The elevator opened directly into the mahogany-paneled boardroom where the Richardson family had made their most important decisions for 3 generations. Richard Richardson Sr. sat at the head of the table, his face already flushed, with concern over the emergency meeting summons. Margaret perched beside him, fingers nervously twisting her tennis bracelet. The other trustees, a mix of family members and longtime advisors, filled the remaining seats, all except one, deliberately left empty at the far end. Elizabeth? Richard's confusion was evident. There must be some mistake. We're having a private financial meeting. No mistake, I replied, setting my briefcase on the polished table. I believe you've been waiting to meet your chief financial advisor in person, the one who's been managing your trust for the past decade. The room fell silent. Margaret's bracelet slipped from her fingers, clattering against the table. Through my earpiece, I could hear Sarah's update. Charles and Victoria just ordered champagne to celebrate the villa purchase they think is happening today. I don't understand, Richard began, but Jonathan Mills, the family lawyer, suddenly sat up straighter, recognition dawning in his eyes. Elizabeth Chen, he breathed. From Sterling Capital, the prodigy who revolutionized family trust management. I nodded, activating the room's presentation system with a code that Charles had spent years trying to obtain. The screens came to life, displaying a decade's worth of financial records, investment strategies, and trust fund growth, all bearing my signature and credentials. Impossible, Margaret whispered. You can barely balance a checkbook. Charles tells us. Charles tells you what he believes, I interrupted smoothly, pulling up the next set of documents. Now let me show you what he's been doing with the money he thinks he controls. The screens filled with transaction records, surveillance photos, and bank statements. Charles and Victoria at luxury hotels, wire transfers to offshore accounts, attempted trust fund withdrawals for private villas and sports cars. This morning, I continued, clicking through to live updates, your son is at the Four Seasons with his mistress, Victoria Pierce, celebrating what he thinks is a successful theft of another $500,000 from our joint account for a villa in the Maldives. Money that, I should note, came from my personal savings, not the trust he's been trying to access. Richard's face had gone from red to white. The emergency protocols that blocked those transfers were designed by me, I confirmed, just like the investment strategies that tripled your family's wealth over the past decade. The same strategies Charles has been taking credit for at every dinner party and family gathering. Through my earpiece, Sarah's voice was quietly triumphant. Charles just tried to process the villa payment. It was declined. He's attempting to access the trust fund now, and finding his access completely revoked. Right on cue, my phone lit up with Charles's name. I set it on the table, switching it to speaker just as his angry voice filled the room. Elizabeth, what the hell is going on? All my accounts are frozen. Hello, Charles, I replied calmly. I believe you're busy with your investment meeting at the Four Seasons. Perhaps you'd like to explain to your parents why you're there with Ms. Pierce instead of at your cryptocurrency seminar? The silence on the other end was deafening. In the boardroom, Margaret's perfectly maintained facade cracked as she stared at the photos on screen. Her precious son caught in dozens of compromising situations with his mistress, each one paid for with money he'd stolen or attempted to steal. I think, Richard said slowly, his voice shaking with rage, you'd better get to this office immediately, Charles. Your financial advisor, your wife, has some very interesting information to share about how you've been managing your responsibilities. Smiled, thinking of Charles's face as his carefully constructed world began to crumble. After all, the best revenge isn't just about revealing deception. It's about choosing the perfect moment to show everyone exactly who you've been all along. 20 minutes later, Charles burst into the boardroom, his perfectly tailored suit wrinkled, and his face flushed with a mixture of rage and fear. He stopped short at the sight of me sitting calmly in the advisor's chair, his parents and the trustees arrayed around the table like a jury. What the hell is this? He demanded. Then noticed the financial records displayed on the screens. His face paled. Elizabeth, what are you doing with those files? Those are confidential trust documents. You mean my documents? I replied smoothly. The ones I created as the chief financial advisor to the Richardson Trust. Please, sit down. We were just reviewing your recent investment strategies. This is ridiculous, he sputtered, looking to his father for support. Dad, she's obviously hacked into something. You know she can barely handle our household accounts. Richard's face was stone. Sit down, Charles, now. Perhaps we should start with your most recent attempt, I suggested, pulling up the morning's transaction records. The $500,000 transfer you tried to process an hour ago for the Maldives villa, the one you plan to surprise Victoria with next week. Charles froze halfway to his chair. Through my earpiece, Sarah whispered, "Victoria just tried to leave the Four Seasons. Security is delaying her as planned." "I don't know what you're talking about," Charles tried, but I was already pulling up more screens. Surveillance photos, bank statements, email exchanges. "Then let me refresh your memory," I continued. "For the past year, you've been systematically draining our joint accounts to fund your affair with Victoria Pierce. When that wasn't enough, you attempted to access the trust fund through increasingly elaborate schemes, shell companies, fake investment proposals, inflated consulting fees. That's all legitimate business," he protested, but his mother's sharp intake of breath told me she'd finally spotted the photos of Charles and Victoria together, dated and time-stamped during events where he'd claimed to be at business meetings, including the $175,000 you transferred to Business Consulting Services LLC last week, I asked innocently. "Interesting consulting work, judging by these hotel receipts and jewelry purchases. You've been spying on me?" Charles's attempt at righteous indignation fell flat as more evidence filled the screens. "No, Charles, I've been doing my job." I turned to the trustees. "The same job I've been doing for the past decade, managing and protecting this family's wealth, often from your son's attempts to misappropriate it." "This is insane," Charles I tried again, but Jonathan Mills, the family lawyer, cut him off. "Ms. Chen's credentials are impeccable," he announced, reviewing my file. "Her track record at Sterling Capital was legendary. The trust's growth under her management has been remarkable, and the documentation of your activities, Charles, is extensive." "You can't seriously believe," Charles began, but froze as his phone buzzed. The text from Victoria flashed on the screen, projected for all to see. "Baby, they won't let me leave the hotel. What's going on? Did the villa payment clear?" The silence in the boardroom was deafening. Margaret's perfectly manicured hand covered her mouth in horror as she stared at her son. Richard's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. "Would you like to see the villa?" I asked pleasantly, pulling up the listing. $2.5 million quite. Lovely. You tried to get the trust to purchase it last week through one of your shell companies. When that failed, you decided to use the money you'd been stealing from our joint accounts instead." "Stealing?" Charles laughed desperately. "It's our money. I'm your husband, and I'm the financial advisor who has been protecting this family's wealth while you tried to squander it." I cut him off. "Every attempted withdrawal, every fraudulent investment proposal, every lie about where the money was going, it's all here, documented, verified, and ready for the authorities if necessary." "The authorities?" Charles whispered, finally grasping the magnitude of his situation. "That depends," I replied calmly, "on how the trustees want to handle your systematic attempt to defraud both the family trust and your wife. Speaking of which, I pulled up one final document. I've taken the liberty of freezing all joint accounts and trust fund access. You'll find your personal credit cards have also been suspended." Charles fumbled for his phone, presumably to check his banking apps. His face went ashen as he found account after account inaccessible. "You can't do this," he breathed. "This is my family's money." "Actually," Richard spoke for the first time since Charles entered, his voice shaking with fury, "it's the trust's money. Money that Elizabeth has spent a decade growing and protecting, while you apparently spent your time finding ways to steal it." "Perhaps," I suggested, standing to face my husband directly, "you should call Victoria back. I'm sure she'll be very understanding when you explain that the villa purchase won't be happening, though she might be less understanding about the other trust fund beneficiaries she's been consulting for. Would you like me to show everyone that evidence as well?" Charles slumped in his chair, his carefully constructed world of lies crumbling around him. Through my earpiece, Sarah confirmed. "Victoria just received the evidence packet about Charles's actual financial situation. She's not taking it well. After all," I thought, watching my husband's face as his phone exploded with angry messages from his mistress. The sweetest revenge isn't just exposing lies. It's watching them destroy each other. The next hour unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of consequences. I remained seated at the advisor's position in the boardroom, watching as Charles's world imploded in real time. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with increasingly frantic messages from Victoria, each one driving another nail into the coffin of his deceptions. "The police are here," Sarah's voice came through my earpiece. Victoria tried to charge $50,000 to Charles's now-frozen credit card, then attempted to leave the Four Seasons without paying her outstanding bill. Hotel security is involved. I pulled up the hotel's security feed on the boardroom screens, letting everyone watch as Victoria created a scene in the lobby, screaming about promised gifts and villa purchases. Charles seemed to physically shrink in his chair as his parents witnessed his mistress's true colors. "Perhaps," Jonathan Mills suggested, reviewing the growing stack of evidence, "we should discuss the legal implications of these activities." The family lawyer's tone was grave as he turned to Charles. "The trust has very specific provisions about fraudulent behavior." Richard Richardson Sr. hadn't spoken since his son's arrival, his face a mask of controlled fury as he processed the extent of the betrayal. Margaret had moved from shocked denial to quiet weeping, her perfect makeup creating dark streams down her cheeks. "I can explain everything," Charles tried again, but his father cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Explain?" Richard's voice trembled with rage. "Explain how you've been attempting to steal from your own family. Explain how you've been lying to everyone, including your wife, who, it turns out, has been the only person actually protecting our legacy." My phone lit up with a notification. "The Trust's quarterly report was just released," I announced, pulling up the documents. "Under my management, the portfolio has shown a 28% increase despite Charles's repeated attempts to misappropriate funds. Would you like to see the comparison with his personal investment attempts?" New graphs appeared on the screens, showing two stark patterns. My steady strategic growth of the family's wealth contrasted against Charles's history of failed schemes and blocked withdrawals. "You'll notice," I continued professionally, "that if Charles had succeeded in his attempted investments over the past year alone, the trust would have lost approximately $12 million. Fortunately, the protection protocols I implemented prevented any unauthorized access." "Those protocols," Charles muttered, a hint of his old arrogance surfacing, "that you never told us about, that you hid, that I created and maintained as part of my role as chief financial advisor," I corrected him. "A role that was fully documented in all trust paperwork, which you apparently never bothered to read carefully. Too busy planning villa purchases with Victoria, perhaps." Right on cue, Sarah's update came through. "Victoria just tried to access the Cayman Islands accounts Charles set up for her. She's discovering they've been frozen as well." Charles's phone buzzed again, this time with a message that made him visibly pale. I didn't need to see it to know that Victoria had just learned the truth about his financial situation. "She's speaking to the hotel management," I informed the room, watching the security feed. "Apparently, she's quite upset about the promises you made regarding her upcoming modeling agency venture, the one you guaranteed with trust fund money. You don't actually control? You've ruined everything," Charles spat, finally dropping his facade of innocence. "All these years, pretending to be financially helpless while spying on me. You mean all these years I spent managing and growing your family's wealth while you tried to steal it?" I replied calmly. "Yes, it must be quite embarrassing to realize that the wife you constantly belittled has been the actual financial genius all along." Margaret had finally found her voice. "All those times you mocked her at dinner parties," she whispered, staring at her son. "While she was the one— oh God, the things we said to her. Which brings us to the next item," I continued, pulling up a new set of documents. the trust's bylaws regarding ethical conduct and fiduciary responsibility. Mr. Mills, would you care to explain the implications? The lawyer cleared his throat. Given the documented evidence of attempted fraud, multiple unauthorized access attempts, and clear intent to misappropriate trust funds, the penalties are quite severe. Immediate revocation of all trust benefits for starters. Charles jumped to his feet. You can't cut me off. This is my family's money. Actually, I corrected him, according to the trust documents your grandfather established, documents I've spent a decade enforcing, this is money you have to prove yourself worthy of managing. Would you like to see your grandfather's specific provisions regarding ethical behavior and financial responsibility? The blood drained from Charles's face as another set of documents appeared on screen. His grandfather's words, written decades ago, outlined exactly what should happen to any family member who attempted to defraud the trust. Effective immediately, Richard announced, his voice heavy with authority. Your access to all trust funds and family accounts is permanently revoked. Your position at Richardson Financial Group is terminated. And, he added, looking at the lawyer, we will be pursuing full legal action regarding the attempted fraud. You might want to call Victoria. Again, I suggested, watching the hotel security feed. She seems to be having trouble with her room charges now that your credit cards have been canceled, though she may be too busy speaking with the other trust fund beneficiaries she's been consulting with. Apparently, they're all very interested in comparing notes about her investment schemes. Charles reached for his phone just as it buzzed with another message, this time from his private bank. I didn't need to see the screen to know they were notifying him about his accounts being frozen pending a fraud investigation. One last thing, I added, standing to gather my materials. You might want to find a new place to stay. The penthouse. Lease is in my name, paid for with my own money, which, unlike you, I actually earned through legitimate financial management. After all, I thought as I watched my husband's world collapse around him, the best revenge isn't just about taking away what someone values, it's about revealing that they never deserved it in the first place. The days following the boardroom, revelation unfolded like a cascade of dominoes, each consequence triggering another in an endless chain of karma. I sat in my newly acknowledged office on the top floor of Richardson Financial Group, reviewing updates as Charles's carefully constructed world continued to crumble. Victoria's been arrested, Sarah reported, entering with her morning briefing. Apparently, after the Four Seasons incident, 3 other wealthy men came forward with similar stories of investment fraud. The police are particularly interested in those Cayman Islands accounts Charles helped her set up. I pulled up the latest media coverage on my screens. The story had exploded across financial circles. Trust fund Scion exposed in multi-million-dollar fraud attempt by secret financial advisor wife. The headlines were getting more dramatic by the hour. Charles's mother is online too, Sarah added. She's called 6 times this morning. I accepted the call, putting it on speaker. Margaret's voice had lost all its usual condescension, replaced by a desperate attempt at damage control. Elizabeth, darling, please. You have to help us contain this. The country club is already whispering. The charity board is asking questions about those auction payments. The same charity board you told I couldn't properly contribute to? I reminded her gently. Don't worry, Margaret. I've already provided them with a complete audit of where their donations actually went. They're particularly interested in the connections to Victoria's fake consulting company. Through my office windows, I could see workers removing Charles's name from his former corner office. He'd tried to access the building this morning, only to find his security clearance revoked and his personal items already packed in boxes, delivered to his mother's house, where he'd been forced to move after finding himself locked out of all our properties. His credit cards are all declining, Sarah reported, checking her tablet. The banks froze everything once they received the fraud investigation documentation. The Ferrari dealership just repossessed his car. Apparently, the last 3 payments bounced. My phone buzzed with a message from Richard. Board meeting in 10 minutes. Need to discuss trust restructuring. The family patriarch had aged years and days, but his business instincts remained sharp. He understood that containing the damage meant swift, decisive action. Victoria's other victims are filing a class action lawsuit, Sarah continued. Their lawyers are particularly interested in Charles's role in her investment schemes. They've requested all our documentation. I authorized the release with a single click. Make sure they receive the offshore account records as well, and update. The trustees. They should know exactly how their golden boy helped his mistress target other wealthy families. The scandal was spreading through high society like wildfire. Charles's former friends were scrambling to distance themselves, especially after learning that some of Victoria's other clients were their own family members. The exclusive clubs where he'd once held court were quietly revoking memberships. Dinner party invitations were being rescinded. Even his regular table at Le Cirque had been given away. His lawyer quit, Sarah added with a slight smile. Apparently, Charles tried to pay the retainer with one of his frozen credit cards. When that failed, he attempted to access his trust fund again, triggering another automatic alert to all trustees. I pulled up the real-time monitoring system I'd designed years ago. Charles had made 16 attempts to access various accounts in the past 24 hours. Each one was automatically documented, adding to the growing evidence of his desperate attempts to maintain his lifestyle. The Four Seasons sent this over, Sarah said, displaying new security footage. Victoria throwing champagne at Charles when she finally realized he had no access to the money he'd promised her. She's apparently already trying to cut a deal with prosecutors, offering to testify about his role in her schemes. My phone lit up with another message, this time from Charles himself, writing from a new email account after I'd blocked his previous ones. You've destroyed everything I built. Happy now? I thought about years of enduring his condescension, of watching him take credit for my financial strategies, of sitting quietly while he mocked my supposed financial ignorance to anyone who would listen. Reply with the trust's quarterly performance reports, I instructed Sarah. The ones showing exactly what he built versus what I actually accomplished. The intercom buzzed, Richard requesting my presence in the boardroom. The trustees were gathering to formalize the trust's restructuring, removing Charles completely from any position of authority or access. They'd also unanimously voted to make my role as chief financial advisor public, ending years of anonymous management. His membership application to the Metropolitan Club was rejected, Sarah noted, checking her updates. Apparently, they don't look favorably on investment fraud. The Hamptons House Committee is meeting tonight to discuss his standing, and the Ferrari Club has already revoked his membership. I stood, gathering materials for the board meeting. Through the glass walls, I could see Charles's former assistant packing up his office, carefully documenting everything for the fraud investigation. His awards and certificates, many for investment strategies I had actually developed, were being placed in bankers' boxes, his name already removed from the wall of honor in the lobby. Victoria's been released on bail, Sarah reported. She gave 3 interviews this morning, detailing how Charles convinced her to help him access trust, fund money through her shell companies. The videos are already trending. I thought about the Charles I'd met years ago, so confident in his ability to manipulate others, so certain of his financial brilliance. Now he was staying in his mother's guest room, his accounts frozen, his reputation in tatters, watching helplessly as his mistress painted him as the mastermind behind her fraud schemes. One more thing, Sarah added as we headed to the boardroom. The country club committee is requesting a meeting. Apparently, they're very interested in having the trust's actual financial advisor join their board, especially after discovering who's really been behind the Richardson family's remarkable investment success. After all, I thought as we walked past Charles's now empty office, the sweetest revenge isn't just watching someone's carefully built facade crumble. It's watching them realize that every piece of it was borrowed from someone they underestimated, all along. 1 month after the revelation that shook the Richardson family to its core, I sat in my office reviewing the final dissolution of my marriage to Charles. The paperwork was impressively thick, page after page documenting the unraveling of his schemes and the protection of assets he'd tried so desperately to claim. "The divorce is official," Sarah announced, placing the court's decision on my desk. The judge was particularly impressed by the documentation of financial misconduct. "Charles's attempts to claim any portion of your personal assets were denied completely." I smiled, thinking of Charles's face when his lawyer, his third, after the first two quit, realized that the prenuptial agreement he'd insisted upon actually protected my assets rather than his. The man who'd spent years mocking my financial acumen had failed to read the fine print on his own marriage contract. "Victoria's plea deal was accepted," Sarah continued, pulling up the latest news reports. "She's agreed to testify against Charles and several other wealthy men she targeted. The prosecutors are particularly interested in those offshore accounts he helped her establish." Through my window, I could see the trust's new board members arriving for their quarterly meeting. After the scandal broke, Richard had initiated a complete restructuring of the family's financial oversight. I'd been unanimously voted in as permanent chief financial advisor, my role now public and my authority absolute. "Charles tried to interview at Blackstone this morning," Sarah reported, checking her tablet. "They declined once they saw the SEC investigation files. That's the fifth financial firm this week to reject him." My phone buzzed with a message from Margaret. Since the revelation, Charles's mother had undergone a remarkable transformation. Gone was the condescending society matron who'd belittled me at every opportunity. Now she was almost painfully eager to demonstrate her appreciation for the woman who'd protected her family's fortune. "Elizabeth, darling," her message read, "the club board voted unanimously to accept your nomination as chairwoman of the investment committee. Charles's membership has been permanently revoked. The charity auction is next week. Would you consider taking a leadership role?" I thought about all the times she'd subtly excluded me from these same committees, suggesting I didn't have the financial sophistication to contribute meaningfully. Now the very people who'd once dismissed me were scrambling to benefit from my expertise. "The final audit is complete," Sarah said, displaying comprehensive spreadsheets. "Over the past decade, your management increased the trust's value by 312%. In contrast, Charles's attempted investments would have resulted in approximately $30 million in losses if you hadn't blocked them." My laptop pinged with an alert. Charles had made another attempt to access his frozen accounts. Since the revelation, he'd been reduced to living on a small allowance in his mother's guest room, his credit cards canceled, his assets frozen pending multiple fraud investigations. "His new girlfriend left him," Sarah added with a slight smile. Apparently, she was unimpressed when his attempt to buy her dinner resulted in a declined credit card. The restaurant staff recognized him from the news coverage. It was quite a scene. Through my private security feed, I could see Charles arriving at his mother's house in an Uber, a far cry from the Ferrari he'd once used to impress his mistresses. His designer suits had been replaced by off-the-rack clothing, his Rolex returned to the trust's assets, his confident strut reduced to a defeated shuffle. "The SEC investigation is expanding," Sarah reported. "They're particularly interested in how he used trust fund money to facilitate Victoria's investment schemes. The prosecutors suggest he could face serious charges." I pulled up the latest trust performance reports, preparing for the board meeting. Under my public leadership, the portfolio had shown remarkable growth, attracting attention from other wealthy families seeking similar protection from spendthrift heirs. "Richard would like a word before the meeting," Sarah mentioned. "He's still struggling with the extent of Charles's betrayal, but he's grateful for your protection of the family legacy. The family patriarch had aged visibly since discovering his son's deceptions, but his business instincts remained sharp. He'd been the first to recognize that publicly acknowledging my role was crucial to maintaining investor confidence. "One more thing," Sarah added, displaying a new email. The Harvard Business Review wants to interview you for a feature on financial advisory innovation. They're particularly interested in the protection protocols you designed to prevent trust fund abuse. I thought about the article they would write. How different it would be from the society pages that had once dismissed me as merely Charles's decorative, financially illiterate wife. The same people who had once smirked at his jokes about my supposed fiscal incompetence were now desperately seeking my investment advice. Charles sent another email, Sarah reported. He's requesting a meeting to discuss reconciliation and access to his trust fund accounts. I glanced at the security feed showing my former husband returning from another failed job interview. The man who had once commanded rooms with his financial bravado was now toxic in investment circles, his reputation destroyed, his schemes exposed. Reply with the trust's latest performance report, I instructed, and attach the court documents, showing exactly why he has no claim to any of those assets. Standing to prepare for the board meeting, I caught my reflection in the office windows. Gone was any trace of the meek, financially helpless wife I'd pretended to be. In her place stood the acknowledged financial powerhouse I'd been all along. After all, I thought as I gathered my materials, the most satisfying resolution isn't just watching someone lose everything they took for granted, it's finally being recognized for everything they never realized you were. 1 year after the revelation that transformed the Richardson family forever, I stood at the podium of the National Financial Advisors Conference, preparing to deliver the keynote address. The irony wasn't lost on me. Last year, Charles had attended this same conference, bragging about investment strategies he'd stolen from my reports to his family's trust. Ms. Chen, the introduction began, has revolutionized the approach to family wealth protection through her innovative oversight systems and strategic investment protocols. Under her management, the Richardson Trust has become a model of financial governance and sustainable growth. The Wall Street Journal profile just went live, Sarah whispered as I approached the microphone. They're calling you the silent guardian of family fortunes. Charles has already tried to contact 3 reporters to tell his side of the story. None of them responded. I smiled, thinking of how differently this scene would have played out a year ago. Back then, I would have been sitting quietly in the audience, playing the role of Charles's financially naive wife while he took credit for my investment strategies. Now, as I surveyed the room full of financial professionals eager to learn from my expertise, I thought about how completely the tables had turned. The SEC investigation concluded this morning, Sarah added, showing me her tablet. Charles is facing federal charges for his role in Victoria's investment schemes. She's already agreed to testify against him as part of her plea deal. My phone buzzed with a message from Richard. The family patriarch had thrown himself into rebuilding the Richardson legacy, working closely with me to implement even stronger protective measures. Board approved your new investment strategy, his text read. Unanimous vote. The trust's value has doubled since you took public control. Through the conference center's windows, I could see the skyline of the financial district where Charles had once held court, bragging about his financial genius while secretly trying to steal from his own family's trust. Now he was living in a modest apartment on the outskirts of town, working as a junior sales associate at a local bank branch. The only job he could find after his fraud became public knowledge. Victoria's sentencing was this morning, Sarah reported during a break. 5 years for investment fraud. Charles's trial starts next month. His new public defender isn't optimistic about his chances, especially with her testifying against him. The transformation of the past year had been complete. The country clubs that had once dismissed me now begged for my membership. The society, matrons who had snickered at my supposed financial ignorance, now desperately sought my investment advice. The financial publications that had once praised Charles's non-existent expertise now analyzed my strategies in detailed cover stories. Charles's mother called again, Sarah noted. The charity board is still hoping you'll take over as chairman. Apparently their endowment has struggled since losing your anonymous guidance. Margaret's evolution from condescending mother-in-law to eager supplicant would have been amusing if it wasn't so transparent. The woman who had once suggested I take basic financial literacy classes was now telling anyone who would listen about her brilliant former daughter-in-law's financial genius. His latest job application was rejected, Sarah added. The investment firm said they couldn't risk association with someone under federal investigation. That's the 15th rejection this month. I thought about the Charles I'd met years ago, so confident in his ability to manipulate others, so certain of his financial brilliance. Now he spent his days processing basic transactions for other people's money, his nights alone in his small apartment, watching as his former world moved on without him. The Harvard Business School case study about your protection protocols is now required reading, Sarah continued. 3 other business schools have added it to their curriculum. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit has requested a consultation about implementing similar systems. My phone lit up with another notification, Charles attempting to reach me through yet another new email account. His messages had evolved from angry demands to desperate pleas as the reality of his situation sank in. No access to trust fund money, no credit, no financial sector prospects, and a looming federal trial. Final update, Sarah said, checking her tablet one last time. Victoria's interview with 60 Minutes airs tonight. The preview clips of her discussing Charles's role in her investment schemes are quite damning. Standing to return to the podium, I caught my reflection in the conference room's glass walls. The carefully crafted mask of financial naivety was gone, replaced by the confident demeanor of a woman finally acknowledged for her expertise. In the audience, I could see faces I recognized from years of anonymous video calls. Other family, wealth managers who had once known me only as a voice and a strategy, now eager to learn from the woman who had exposed and prevented a sophisticated attempt at trust fund fraud. The transformation of wealth management isn't just about numbers, I began my speech, watching my former husband's colleagues lean forward attentively. It's about understanding human nature, especially the nature of those who feel entitled to wealth they didn't earn. I thought about all the pieces that had fallen into place over the past year. Charles's complete downfall, Victoria's conviction, the trust's extraordinary growth under my public leadership, and the sweet satisfaction of finally being recognized for the financial expertise I'd hidden for so long. After all, I reflected as I addressed the room full of financial professionals. The most satisfying revenge isn't just exposing someone's lies or watching their carefully constructed facade crumble. It's not even about the public recognition of your own abilities or the vindication of your hidden strength. The sweetest revenge is knowing that while they spent years underestimating you, you were quietly building the very system that would ultimately expose their deceptions and ensure they could never harm anyone else again. In the end, Charles hadn't just lost his money, his reputation, and his freedom. He'd lost the one thing he valued most, his carefully constructed illusion of power. And in its place, the world finally saw the truth, that the wife he'd mocked and belittled had been the real financial genius all along.